Hello and welcome to We Are One at One. I'm Pastor Caitlin Trussell. So today I would like to talk a little bit about the lectionary, which I'm only going to start there, so don't panic. The lectionary is a way that we follow scripture over the course of a 3-year cycle. And the lectionary has daily readings, and the lectionary has Sunday readings that are particular to us. And so it's one of the ways that we think about our oneness across the whole church. There are lots of denominations that follow the Revised Common Lectionary. And a couple weeks ago, at the beginning of June, we started a series in the lectionary that will continue through the early Sundays of September, out of the letter to the Romans. So out of the Bible's book of Romans. It was a very important book in the development of Lutheran Christianity. Martin Luther had some very specific things to say. I wrote them down. Let's see. Oh, shoot. He called the letter to the Romans truly the purest gospel. It is a bright light, almost sufficient to illuminate the entire Holy Scripture. And as we go from week to week to week to week through the letter to the Roman Church, there's a couple things that I would like to suggest. One is, just as we did when we started the year of Matthew in December, I invited people to read the book of Matthew. I am now inviting people to read the letter to the Romans. It's 16 chapters. You can take a chapter a day and be done in just about 2 weeks. Or take a chapter a week and keep on going through the summer. So the book of Romans is unique, actually. Paul wrote to churches that he founded, and he was writing to the Church of Rome, the churches in Rome, that had become part of congregations that were run by Gentile Christians, not Jewish Christians. The Jews had been kicked out of Rome. The Jewish Christians had been kicked out of Rome at that time. The Roman Church was curated by the Gentile Christians, and then when the Jewish Christians returned to Rome, there was some conflict. So Paul was writing to the church in Rome because there was some conflict around what the law means. What does the law of God mean? And who were the Gentile Christians if they weren't following the Jewish law? So there was some contention around that. And more than a history lesson, I promise, I think it's relevant to argue a bit about what law means in these days and times. I was talking with a colleague of mine recently and wondering about all the ways in which people set up these different checklists of self-righteousness. We all do it. We all set up whatever it is we think righteousness looks like, and then we apply it to ourselves, hoping that somehow that makes us a more moral person. And then we just sort of apply that to everybody else and say, if you're going to be a person, we take it a step further very often, and we say, if you're going to be a person, a true human, beloved by God, then your righteousness will also look this particular way. And so Paul, in his letter to the Romans, was saying, okay, let's flip the script on righteousness. Number one, righteousness comes through the cross of Christ, and by grace, the grace on which we stand, as he said earlier in Romans chapter 4. So if it's by grace, then that whole righteousness, piety, law script gets flipped. And this is important because right now, as our culture and society seem to be running amok in terms of who has the loudest yelling voice, it's important to remember that across our shared humanity and across the humanity of being beloved by God, that includes the person you're screaming at, by the way, it's important to remember that the baseline on which we stand is the grace on which we stand. So when Paul says in chapter 1, verse 7, to all God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints, he's not talking about following a new subscription of the law. He's saying the saints whose righteousness has come through the cross of Christ, first and foremost by grace. And this is the unifying feature of who we are as Christians and how we look, the lens through which we look at the world. And it's why the book of Romans is so critical and why I think it has so much to say to us this summer as we continue in this time of pandemic, as we continue in this time of civil protest. You know, there's a lot of encouragement right now to draw really hard and fast lines of where we're standing in time, and some of that I believe is good. I think we have an enormous amount of public lament in terms of people like George Floyd being killed, and so many Black people being killed at the hands of police and other people, to where we've gotten to a point where living while Black feels like a death sentence to our Black friends and neighbors. That we're in this time of higher accountability for police officers and law enforcement, which, by the way, is a good and right thing. You know, one of the highest. We've all seen what happens when that is not true. As a former nurse, when nurses were not behaving ethically and held accountable, people die. So it's more than okay that law enforcement is being held accountable for the ways, for the good of the neighborhood, and so this public lament time that we're in, I think is bearing fruit, and raising up the lives of the people around us, the Black lives of the people around us who need some extra protection and extra thought and care. So in the midst of all of that, to say that if it is the grace on which we stand, as it says in the letter to the Romans, and the righteousness is not my own, then when we hear things like, I've become very aware that there's this language from the political right that talks about, that sort of accuses the political left of virtue signaling, and then the political left will accuse the right of dog whistling, and you know, the chaos of how that all gets discussed and argued about and yelled about, it is overwhelming. I think simply want to do right by our neighbors, and we're attempting to do so on all different kinds of levels. Reverend William Barber tweeted recently that we need to take great care in not becoming the very worst traits of our enemies. That it is not a call upon our hearts as we're challenging the way the world works, as we're challenging sort of social agreements that have become unacceptable, as we're challenging those things, it's imperative that we not become the very hate that we're working against. And so the book of Romans, as we take that oneness of the lectionary, and as we take the oneness that Paul, the Apostle Paul, is encouraging us into, it's important that we share that together and we hold ourselves accountable so that we don't start dehumanizing one another. You know, Paul was really driving home to this Roman church in the first century that we are all human together, and they were the church together, and they were forgetting that. They were forgetting how unified they were around the cross of Christ. So I just leave you with some of those thoughts around this way that we set up a new piety kind of law, and then and then hold other people's humanity as either valuable or not valuable. And I encourage us to think about that and pray about that and wonder about that together, even as some of us in the public lament world of Black are saying, yeah, Black lives do matter, and they haven't mattered, and that's how we're in this situation. So as we're doing all of those things, I just would invite us to be thoughtful about how that works for us. So in that spirit, I'm going to read a blessing. Oh, here it is. I'm going to offer a blessing to you. So this blessing was written as part of Lutheran worship. A paraphrase of Romans chapter 8. You heard it at the end of worship last week, and you'll hear it forward this summer. Now receive this blessing. Neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers nor height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate